thanks all for coming out. I know it has been a very long day, and next on your schedule is a lobster dinner. I am aware of this, but I do want to tell you about patents today, and I'm going to keep it light. And in fact, I want to tell you a story about a patent system that has gone awry over the past 35 years, and what economists have done to fix it. Macroeconomics has actually elevated intellectual property to a higher level of prominence. So modern growth theory, we know, has identified innovation as one of the key drivers of economic growth. Intellectual property is supposed to be one of the key policy instruments for driving innovation. So as economists, we should want to know whether or not it works. And so when I ask that question, do patents work, I'm actually asking, do patents encourage innovation? Now, my story begins around 1980. The patent system was fairly straightforward before 1980. I mean, you still had the, you gotta be kidding patents, like a method for concealing baldness by dividing your hair, what's left of your hair into 3 parts. But for the most part, oh, does anybody want me to keep that up there just in case you want to write it down? Get the number for the pen? Okay. But for the most part, an invention was patentable if it was novel, non-obvious, and useful, and it was not a thing of nature, and it was not a mathematical idea or principle. Okay? But then in 1980, the US Supreme Court, and again, this is going to be a bit US-centric, because that's where all the policy changes were pretty exciting, that had global implications. It's also where many of the empirical studies were done using those kind of, I mean, it's not done there, but they use the data of the United States. But I'm hoping to kind of show some implications for Canada at the end. But in 1980 or so, the US Supreme Court blurred the line between what is patentable and things of nature when it allowed a patent on genetically modified bacteria. And then whole animals were patented, like the transgenic mice, like this cute little onco mouse, this is from Harvard, that was susceptible to cancer. And then human gene sequences. But next, the line was blurred between what's patentable and mathematical kind of abstract ideas when software was elevated from copyright status to patent status. And then came along business methods, patents in 1998. And those were things like, you know, online Dutch auctions. You know, this was a selling method that had been known for centuries. So this expanded patentable subject matter, but what really had a fairly large impact was when the Court of Appeals was centralized. There was one centralized Court of Appeals of the Federal Circuit, the CAFC, and the reason for doing this, and they would only hear patent cases, and the reason for doing this was to avoid what patentees were doing. They were forum shopping. They were going around from place to place to try to find the court that would be friendliest to it. It was also to try to increase the expertise of the judges on the panel, because that's the only, you know, those are the only cases that they heard. Can you imagine anything more boring? Anyway, and so the Court of Appeals is important, but what it turned out to be is a pro-patent court. So these are some data from a paper that showed, you know, if you look at the data of all the cases, the, say, invalidity cases that reached the CAFC, you look before it was formed and after it was formed, the probability or the proportion of times that the court ruled in favor of the patentee went from 15% to over 40%. Then, in addition to these two kind of pro-patent things, then it went global. Patents, intellectual property, ended up in a lot of trade agreements. There's a clause in NAFTA, that's the part that probably Trump will want to keep in NAFTA, where companies can go after countries. And Eli Lilly, for example, has gone after Canada, saying that they're not strong enough. We're not strong enough on our patents. The trade-related intellectual property agreement, TRIPS, is one of the most significant. So this was the case where in 1995, starting in 1995, all WTO countries were obligated to adopt patents, even the poorest of countries. And what really had a significant impact was like in India, which was a generic drug maker that was very, very important. Now they had to have product patents, where before they had much weaker, narrower patents of process. So what did the US get for all of this? Well, they got a lot more patents and a lot more applications. And it also sort of catapulted lawyers into the top 1% of the distribution because they got a lot of litigation. Now you'll see the litigation kind of moves along with the patents, increase in patents a little bit faster. But, you know, okay, so economists and policymakers looked at that and said, what is that saying? What does this mean? Does this mean that by strengthening patents in all these ways that we actually got more innovation that we otherwise would not have gotten? Or does it just mean there's a higher propensity to patent? Now, if firms are patenting their stuff more, disclosing it, that could be a good thing. But not if it's on, you know, very low quality inventions, or it's old inventions that were sitting on the shelf collecting dust, and now the firms are looking and going, hey, it's so easy to get a patent, let's dust it off and let's use it as a financial instrument. We can go after firms and sue them and get royalties. So that became the question, is what we're seeing here, is this productive new innovation, or is this just an increase in strategic patenting? Okay, so this led to decades of economists getting excited about this question and doing lots of empirical and theoretical work on it. And the initial studies were more like aggregate studies. And so they mostly, you know, gave correlations. But the initial studies did not bode well for the patent system. Very few papers could find a significant relationship between increasing patents and increasing innovation. And then that's when the anti-patent movement started. This was not the only time that patents have been controversial. Just about every 50 years, there's a new debate on the patent. And a really interesting, lively one was in the mid 19th century or so. So you had the anti-patent free trade group against the pro-patent protectionist group. And then when the financial crisis of 1873 hit North America and Europe, the pro-patent guys won out. Anyway, and so then, 50 years later, there was another debate. And Mackup and Penrose describe it quite well. If we did not have a patent system, it would be irresponsible on the basis of our present knowledge of its economic consequences to recommend instituting one. But now, it would be irresponsible on the basis of our present knowledge to recommend abolishing it. Well, fast forward another 50 years, and we have a new resistance movement led by two theorists, Boulder and Levine, who say the 50 years since have turned up no evidence that patents increase innovation, and we must now conclude that Mackup's policy advice is obsolete. On the basis of the present knowledge, progressively but effectively abolishing intellectual property protection is the only socially responsible thing to do. So let's look at that. Let's kind of unpack that. All right, because since they wrote their book Against Intellectual Monopoly, there has been oodles of papers, lots of research done. So what I'd like to do is give you a little sense of what the theory is and the empirical work that informs this debate. And it's not going to be a review of everything. I'm going to leave so much stuff out. But I want to focus on two things that I thought might be kind of, you know, cool for you guys to hear it at this late hour. And that's thickets and trolls. Yeah, thickets and trolls. And then I want to turn to the market for antibiotics, or the drug market, and talk about some work with Mukesha Swarn, because the drug market is the place where patents are supposed to work. Okay, so we'll be critical of the patent system up to then, and this is where it's supposed to work, and even then, there are some doubts. Okay, so let's start with the theory. So the theory of cumulative and sequential innovation. This change in the way we thought about patents, about innovation in the industrial organization literature, coincided with the endogenous growth theory. Okay, so how did we think about patents before? As an isolated invention that stood alone. So maybe the gene, a patented gene, or a drug. But the cumulative innovation said, no, innovation is path dependent. That innovation builds upon each other, so you need that gene that was discovered in order to get the drug. Okay, this is hardly anything new, right? That innovation is cumulative. But what it did was powerfully change the way we think about patents. And in particular, what was important was that as a result of this, it gave a prediction that it was possible. The stronger patents got, the less innovation we might get from it. Okay, so to see this, I mean, I think it's going to be pretty clear, but when you think about, well, I'm going to focus on a policy instrument of the patent policy, which is patent breadth, patent scope. And you can think about that circle around that gene-related disease as being in two-dimensional product space. And anything that's enclosed in that circle is, here, I can use this little guy. Anything enclosed in here would infringe that patent. Same with this one. But the two are kind of isolated. They're not related. Now, if we enlarge the breadth of that gene patent so that it gets some of the profits from the drug, not a bit, that might make sense because the gene may be a research tool or some other invention that actually isn't commercialized, so it's not going to make any money. So it sort of needs money from that next product, that application, in order to have the incentive to innovate. But now the firm's going to say, great, the patent's broader, I get more money, I'm definitely going to want to innovate. But if the breadth becomes too broad, now that second firm is going to say, okay, I know patents are probabilistic property right, but the probability has just gone up now that after I invest in my drug, that the gene guy is going to come along and expropriate all my quasi-rents. So I'm just not going to enter this market. I'm not going to do the research. Well, if that firm doesn't do the research, already we see how innovation could fall by making patents stronger. But now the whole market has declined, the whole pie has declined, and so even the first firm will have less incentive to do research as patent breadth gets larger, or as patents get stronger, so to speak. So the social planner's problem then is to find a patent breadth that divides total profits, or the pie, so that researchers at both stages have the incentive to develop innovation. So what's the answer to that? Well, Green and Scotchmer said, you know what, if you have broad patents, it's okay, as long as there are ex-ante contracts. And now this brings in a whole realm of antitrust. What kind of contracts can you write? But if you have ex-ante contracts, now the first guy is going to go to the second guy, they're going to play a Nash bargaining game, the breadth of the patent is going to be sort of threat points, and they're going to make it work, right? Both innovations will be made. If ex-ante contracts are not available, then maybe you want to just keep the patents narrow so that the second firm has the incentive to do research, but maybe not too narrow so that the first firm still gets something. So the real question when we think about the prediction from this and how to test it, the real question then is, why wouldn't there be opportunities to write contracts? Well, there are two problems in innovation markets that are actually really typical of today's modern technologies. The first is, and I'm sure many of you have heard of this, the anti-commons problem. And here, instead of just having one research tool to license to make the drug, now you have many to license. And so you've got all these firms to negotiate with, all these transaction costs. Some of them may hold out to get a higher price because they're all essential to make that second invention. There are ways around this. You could have a patent pool. And so these three guys get together and they sell it as a bundle. If they're all complements, then the price is going to go down. Hey, everything could be great. This does raise antitrust issues. I've written a little bit in this, and Jean Terrell, Josh Lerner, Carl Shapiro, and various others have worked on patent pools. But they're not always possible. They might be anti-competitive. But there is actually a problem a bigger problem that compounds the anti-commons one. So you're coming into this invention, or you're coming into this market, you want to invent this thing. You think, hey, I have these 4 guys I have to license from. That's okay. But then you find out, wait a minute, there's overlapping patents. So there are these patents that are given out where, some of the claims in the patent are related. They might have the same molecule. They might have the similar functionality. And the patent office has given all those guys a patent. And so you're there going, oh, okay, I guess I have to license to all 6 of them. But then wait a minute, there might be a bunch more out there that you have to license to, and you have to find them, and there's overlapping patents, and they're in your research area or another research area, so it's way too costly to figure out exactly whom you have to license from, but is really costly not to because they'll sue you otherwise. So what you do is you just stay out of the market because there's no way contracts are going to be able to be written in this market. You stay out, or alternatively what you do is you accumulate more patents so that when you're sued, you can cross-license with the guy who sued you, right? But what does that do? That just makes this thicket thicker. And so this is what I mean by a patent thicket. Well, in case you think this is just a theoretical, fiction, this is a real patent thicket in the smartphone market. These are all the guys who are suing each other or settling with each other and so on and so forth. So what is a prediction from this theory then? It's that broad patents block follow-on research, where contracting is difficult. And I'm going to use synonymously where contracting is difficult as being in a thicket industry. But it may not block patents where contracting is possible, for example, in non-thicket industries. So now you're thinking, what are these thicket industries and non-thicket industries? Well, that brings me to the empirical literature. I'm not going to go through all of this, but what I'd like to point out is they're all in the last 5 years. A lot of these are young people who are working on this, Heidi Williams and Alberto Galasso from University of Toronto, Petra Moser. But there's all these papers coming out. And the thing that is interesting about these papers is that they actually directly test that theory of sequential innovation. They focus, however, on a kind of a different component of patents. They focus on the follow-on innovation. They ask, do patents block follow-on research, rather than do they inspire that first stage of research in the first place? So you want to keep that in mind, because that's really what they're looking at, as that second stage part. They're all different in some ways. They have different measures of what it means to increase or reduce patent protection. They might work in different industries. So technically, they're not comparable. I don't do the empirical work, so I'm going to invoke a little bit of artistic license and put them all together and try to glean some general principles that we can take away from this that can inform policy, okay? But before I tell you what they are, what those results look like, I thought I would take you through one of the models just to get a gist of how they process this problem. And this is the fun part. So I think this is where I apologize to the econometricians in the audience, because there's only going to be one slide. Oh, I'm not there yet. The next one is my only slide. Oh, well, unless you count the test by hypothesis, one of the slides. All right, so remember the prediction from the theory was broad patents block in thicket industries? Well, that means if you remove the patent, then you would expect to see an increase in innovation, right? If they blocked innovation, you take it away, then you would expect to see an increase in innovation. And that's what Galasso-Schenkerman do. That's what they're testing. Invalidating patents increases follow-on research to a greater extent in thicket than non-thicket industries, invalidating patents. So what they're looking at is a data set that are cases that went to that central court I told you about, the federal court of the appeals court. And so these are all the cases that reached that court. So it's a highly selective sample, because these are fairly valuable that they got that far. And then they asked the question, and here's that one slide. And what you're wanting really to focus on is beta, that invalidated thing. So they control for a lot of stuff and lots of fixed effects and stuff. But they're interested in beta, and they're asking, if the patent got invalidated, did we see more innovation? How is more innovation defined? By post sites. After the case is decided, then do we see firms actually citing that, using that patent more than before? Okay? You're looking, I can see David looking at that going, all right, there's an endogeneity problem. That invalidation, that decision to invalidate has to be endogenous. And probably because if there's a shock that suddenly raises the value of that patentee, then you better believe the patentee, the owner of that patent, is going to invest and get a lot of lawyers to try to prevent the thing from getting invalidated, right? So what do? Well, they have an identification strategy that might be common that you've done before, but there's these two features of this of this court, that all the decisions are made by a three-panel judge, or three-judge panel rather, and they're determined by a computer program. It's randomized, right? So these three guys are chosen randomly, and it's also clear that these judges have different propensities to invalidate. That's independent of this particular patentee. So they come up with this instrument, which is a judge invalidity propensity, right? And it's based on these three judges. You'll see the three, you know, and the F is the fraction of cases that Judge I, that any Judge I that was assigned to this case, this patent P, voted for invalidity in the past. What proportion of time did they vote for that? So you guys can debate whether or not this is a good instrument, but maybe not here. Thanks. So anyway, that's what they do, and they find that on average, when patents are invalidated, there is a 50% increase in innovation. But there's a lot of heterogeneity going on there. And so they unpack the heterogeneity in two ways. First, they look at the industries, the research areas, and they look at the size of the firm. So now I'm going to tell you about the Thicket Industries. So they look, are these Thicket Industries or not Thicket Industries? And they get the information. There's been lots of studies, all these NBR things, and Brownwin Hall and West Cohen and various others have done this classification in these sort of complicated ways of looking to see where patents overlap. And it's pretty well accepted that Thicket Industries are ICT industries, information communication technologies, and they're electronics, semiconductors. Medical instruments and biotech are a little bit more confused. Are they really Thicket? But they're under there. And the non-Thicket, you think drugs. So when you think Thicket, think ICT. When you think non-Thicket, think drugs. Now, I think gene patents are also under the drug part, but it's the tools, like the diagnostic tests and stuff, that comes under that biotech part. So these are the two kinds of classifications. And when they control for this, they find that actually, in Thicket Industries, when patents are invalidated, the research or citations go up 200%. And it's insignificant for non-Thicket Industries. Insignificant for drugs, significant 200%. When they turn them to firms, they have small, medium, large firms. Small firms are defined as firms, this is according to patents, that they're small, medium, large. I think it's the bottom quartile. If they have less than 5 patents, and there are a lot of firms with less than 5 patents, they're called small. If they have greater than 100, which is the top quartile, then they're called large, and everything in the middle is medium. And there's one case in which invalidating a patent matters. Large firms don't get blocked when a large firm has a patentee. Small firms don't get blocked when a small firm is the patentee. But when that small firm is trying to use a patent on a large firm, it gets blocked. Okay, so what does this all say? This is really support for the theory, because it's saying that in Thicket Industries, where it's hard to write contracts, so you don't know with whom you should be writing the contract, patents are going to block. Whereas in drugs, they manage to somehow negotiate around their patents, around their property rights. So you might see big firms with large firms, or large firms with biotech firms, but they manage to do it. Thicket Industries, they can't. In the case of the size of the firm, that's also support, because as we were saying before, small firms do not have other mechanisms for dealing with firms' patents, like cross-licensing. They just don't have the large portfolios for making trades. So this is actually a pretty good test of the theory. So what do we say? What do we do with this? Well, there's kind of a temptation to say, all right, Bolden Levine, you're right. Let's abolish patents in Thicket Industries. But that would be wrong, because what are we looking at? We're looking, the treatment was on an invention that was already there, right? And we invalidated a patent that was already there to see if it blocked further future research. Invalidating is very different from abolishing, because if you abolish the patent, that invention may not have been there in the first place, because that might have motivated the guy thinking, okay, I might get invalidated, but I might not. So from an ex ante point of view, they had the incentive to develop the innovation. So that, you can't quite say abolish, but what we can say is that thicket industries are problematic. So why don't we try to fix the thicket industry? Let's try to fix the thicket. Can we clear it out in some way? And that brings me to your favorite topic of trolls. Okay, not the kind in the White House. This is these cute little critters called non-practicing entities. So these are firms that don't make anything. They just buy up patents and they threaten to sue and they collect royalties. Okay, they don't research. Universities are non-practicing entities, but they're not, we don't think they're trolls. So what I want to tell you about is a case which do you all know about the RIM case? In 2006 was actually when the recent troll craze started. But let's go back a little bit, 2001. RIM had just gone public. Research in Motion, our very own Canadian firm, had just gone public. And NTP, a troll, sued it for allegedly infringing 5 of its patents. NTP threatened to shut down the whole BlackBerry system. They wanted to issue an injunction to shut down the whole system. And so the Justice Department of the United States even went to our little Canadian firm and said, do something about this. We all use BlackBerries. Well, they went to the patent office and said, can you please declare that these patents are invalid? And they lost. And so they said, you know what, in 2006, we don't have a choice. And they paid out $612 million to NTP. Guess what? A few years later, those patents were invalidated. And they didn't get their $600 million back. But at least the injunction didn't happen. Okay, so that is when the craze happened for trolls. But along with trolls coming out of the woodwork, so did economists. Because now we have 10 years since then, lots of data, and so this is kind of like the hot topic. There's all of a sudden these papers on trolls because of this 10-year period. I'm not going to go through each one, but I'm going to tell you what the findings are. What do we know about trolls? Well, the question that they ask is, do trolls reduce innovation? And you might think, well, of course, you know, if this is what they're doing. But no, there is another side, and it's a side that's articulated by trolls that say, you know what, we're really an important financial intermediary. We help those little guys, you know, to navigate the patent thicket, and we also police for infringement against those really big bad guys who are going to come after you. So they argue that they are really good for innovation, for helping the small innovator. And in fact, trolls think so highly of themselves that there are now even trolls trying to help, or allegedly helping small firms against other trolls. So this has become quite an interesting area. And some studies have been done, this one here, Cohen, Gruen, and Commoners, and that's 2014. These are all the litigation cases that have involved the public firms since 2005. And so the blue are the total cases. Practicing entities, so these are firms that actually produce something. They're the steady green line. And the non-practicing entities, which include universities, like I said, but that's actually a very small percentage compared to trolls, which are also called patent assertion entities. That's the red line. And you can see this increase in litigation indeed just kind of follows that. They seem to be the cause for this increase in litigation. But it's kind of astonishing to me that they attribute so much of this increased litigation. So one of the things they also show is when they compare two nearly identical firms, both of those firms are sued by a troll. And in one case, the firm loses to the troll, and in the other case, the case is dismissed. Those firms that lose to the troll, they reduce their innovation by 20% afterwards. So there's some evidence that, in fact, it's hurting the targeted firms. Does it hurt those little small firms that they're trying to help? There's no evidence that the small firms are supposedly helping increase their innovation, and some studies say the pass-through to the firms they're trying to help is something like 5% of their winnings. So, you know, that's not looking good. Where do they locate themselves? Well, I took the numbers from the paper and tried to map it into the same table I showed you before. And sure enough, there they are in the thicket industry. They just love thicket industries. Now, are they causing the thicket industry, or are they attracted to the thicket industry because they're so confusing, right? There's so much uncertainty in thicket industries that they can, kind of pop behind somebody and sue them. But they're big in communications and computers, big in electronics, not so big in medical instruments, but some people are sort of saying that they might start going into that, a little bit in mechanical, but you see it really is mostly in those areas. What else do we know about them? Oh, we know that their patents are low quality. There are lots of papers. Are they high quality, low quality? And this paper here, I think it's, sorry, I think it was this Feng and Girabel. They were saying, no, it's low quality, and they're often patents that they buy or ones close to expiration. So what we did was we just plotted some OECD data, and we looked at, and WIPO data, and we looked at total patents, and then we looked at triotic patents. And 1980 everything is indexed by the 1980s, so they start at the same place. And I looked at two different periods of time. One was when business method patents were allowed in 1998, and then this is when RIM came along. So triotic patents are considered higher quality. And I should say, patents became stronger in Canada and Europe, but not to the same extent as they did in the United States. So some of those patents, like business method patents, they wouldn't fly in some of these other countries. So here you go. You see that just around the time business method patents were allowed, while patents were still going up, the triotic, those higher quality ones, are not going up as high. So it does, it's not a causal relationship at all, but it is consistent with what this paper shows, that in fact the quality of trolls patents are fairly low. So the evidence is pretty clear that trolls are not a good thing. So what can we do about it? Well, during the Obama administration, he was hot to trot to get rid of these trolls, and Congress was too. So they proposed 10 bills, but none of them got passed, right? But the US Supreme Court was not asleep at the wheel. The US Supreme Court, way back in 2006, after the RIM, took away automatic injunctions. It said you can't just automatically. After all, you're a troll. You don't produce anything. And you're stopping production of another firm that, they're not taking any of your business away, right? So they did not allow automatic injunctions. So, of course, since there was this before and after, it was the eBay versus Merck exchange. When you see a before and after, what do you see next? You see an economist asking questions. So Mazzanotti, who's at Northwestern, looked at this to say, what was the effect of the eBay decision? And he shows a lot of stuff. He looks before and after the decision, and he divides the firms into those that are more likely, high risk to be in litigation areas, and those that are less likely to be in litigation areas. I'm not going to talk about that. I just wanted to show you this graph because it's late in the day and graphs are nice. So this is when the decision took place, and there was a precipitous drop in the stock returns for those who were identified as NPEs. And like I said, the majority of those are trolls. And the drop, it was like just before the decision, at the decision, and afterwards, and it never recovered. So you see some evidence here that things are not looking good for trolls, but it really isn't looking good, because the Supreme Court now, they've had enough. So there are two other cases, Bilski and Alice. And what these ended up doing, or they didn't abolish the patents. They don't want to go that far, but they're starting to, remember this thicket? They're starting to narrow the patent. So now you see they're not overlapping as much, and they're starting to clear the thicket, but not abolishing the patents yet. And how are they doing it? Well, it used to be the case that for business method patents, you just needed an idea, like the Dutch auction, and a computer, and then you could get patent. And they said that's not enough. We need novel, non-obvious, useful. And so the Alice apparently shook the community, that, the Supreme Court is against business method patents and they're so valuable. Yeah, they're valuable for getting a lot of rents. So here, but the thing that struck me the most about these cases is the part in red. It says, monopolization through the grant of a patent might tend to impede innovation more than it would tend to promote it, thereby thwarting the primary object of the patent laws. This is really neat, because the trade-off before, when we were in the isolated invention case, was always between we have a patent in order to increase innovation, but at the cost of higher prices to consumers from monopoly pricing. And now what they've adopted here is the cumulative innovation model. They said, no, now we have patents to encourage innovation, but at the cost of getting less innovation tomorrow. The economists have had a real impact on the Supreme Court. And if you dig a little bit more deeply, you will see some of those papers I mentioned cited in a lot of the amicus briefs. Heidi Williams is in the Myriad case and various other ones. So, this is a nice thing that's happening. So here we go. We've got these thicket industries that seem to be causing a problem for close to 35 years. And now the Supreme Court is pushing back, not abolishing yet. That's the thicket industry. What about the non-thicket industries? Like drugs. And that brings me to the case of antibiotics. In this market, patents do appear to work in the sense of motivating innovation. And let me just go back a step. When we're looking at drugs, what I actually showed so far was that drugs do not block future research. But that's kind of a faint praise for patents, that they don't get in the way. But do they actually motivate innovation? And there is quite a bit of evidence. Now, the evidence is a bit anecdotal. It's from surveys. It's kind of common sense. Drugs are expensive to make. An antibiotic, for example, is $1 billion, takes 10 years. They're expensive, they're easy to copy, there's huge FDA regulations. So you could kind of see how patents would be important. To put it a little differently, Big Pharma said research would halt. There was something, I just saw a paper fresh off the press at NBER, and there's more papers now showing just how important patents are to small firms. I won't go through those, but they don't even need to be in the pharmaceutical industry necessarily, but small firms, obviously, it gives access, patents give access to capital. But other studies also show that small firms like to actually do research where there are other large firms around. Why? Because they're not planning on competing with them. They want to be bought up by those guys. So patents really do seem to matter, both in not blocking, they block small firms, but they matter in terms of motivating research. So we kind of have some evidence to suggest patents do motivate research in drugs. But then the question then becomes kind of an interesting higher plane question, which is, but are they the best incentive mechanism for encouraging innovation? Just because they motivate some research, do they motivate enough? Is there a better mechanism that we could use? So that, like I said, brings me to antibiotics. Okay, so Mukesh and we were interested in this market, and what we end up showing is, patents are actually important in antibiotics, but not for the reason of encouraging innovation. You need something else to get innovation. And we start with a story in which there are no thickets, no patent thickets, just like the empirical literature says to do. But there is a biological force that is much stronger than thickets, and that's natural selection. So natural selection is sort of makes a drug self-destructive. The more successful it is, the more opportunities that a bacteria has to mutate and resist the drug, therefore shortening the life of the drug. And by the way, the bacteria do not work alone. We're all complicit in this. Every time we do not take an antibiotic for its full course, use it incorrectly, or not even internalize. Every time you use antibiotics, feel a little guilty because you're reducing the effectiveness of it tomorrow for someone else or even maybe for yourself. And when we don't internalize that, that makes the resistance problem even greater. Okay, and there's a big worry. Why? Because science and bacteria have been in a race and science is starting to lose. So this is Staphylococcus aureus. This is a bacterium that is found in hospitals, pervasive in hospitals. And these are the different generations, starting with penicillin. And I show when they're introduced and then when the resistance started. And you can see the resistance starts shortly after they're introduced, except for vancomycin. But the reason vancomycin didn't come in, the resistance didn't come in right away, is because it was actually toxic. So they didn't use it, but now it is the drug of last resort. That's all that's left for some of these, maybe Staphylococcus aureus, but something else. And while all these superbugs are forming, we've got antibiotic labs closing. Only 4 of the 11, I don't have all 11 there, only 4 of the 11 labs that were heavily involved in doing research in antibiotics are going to chronic diseases where they're making a lot more money. So these labs are closing, and the pipeline is running dry. The new drugs that are coming available has been declining over time. But what's most concerning is that new mechanisms for killing the bacteria are not being discovered. The last one was 25 years ago. So for example, one class of drugs might be they destroy the cell wall of the bacterium. Another one might be they stop the protein synthesis reactions. So there are different classes of this. New stuff is being found. There was something found at Northeastern University in the soil. That's hopeful. 10 years off. We've got a ways to go. The concern here is that, well, right now, about 700,000 people die worldwide from antibiotic resistance alone. A study shows that by 2050, big T, about 10 million people will die per year worldwide. And as you might expect, it's located in a lot of it's located in developing countries. I'm not sure if that number, now that I'm thinking about it, if it includes the loss of life from people no longer being able to take, say, chemotherapy. A lot of modern medicine relies on antibiotics, right? Anything that affects your immune system, chemotherapy, AIDS treatments, even basic routine surgeries like hip replacements will be at risk because you don't have the antibiotics to take after you have those surgeries. So, what do we do about this? Well, UK and US, they're throwing money at firms and saying, make drugs, make drugs. And so there are prizes that are being given out. How are we doing on time? There are prizes that are given out, and that's fine, but Mukesh and I wanted to look a little bit more at the resistance issue. I mean, you need the extra drugs, but at the same time, let's slow down resistance. Because you get another drug, there's going to be more resistance. You're going to need another drug. So how do you slow down resistance? Well, to bring it back to what I've been talking about, here's where patents come in. Well, the only way to reduce resistance is by reducing output. But what firm with a finite patent is going to be willing to reduce output? Because any of the benefits from extending the life of the patent will have to be shared with generic firms afterwards. So, easy solution, Laxmanarian and others have said, increase patent life. Give them a longer life, and then they'll internalize that. Well, that works in terms of reducing resistance for that amount of the drug made, but it turns out that other drugs out there, as they're being produced, cross-resistance. The bacteria is getting cross-resistance to that drug X. So just by way of pictures are always nice. So if we really care about drug X, it's the pioneer drug. When you make drug X, let's just say that the bacteria builds up resistance by theta for that as you produce a unit of that drug X, and same with Y. But also when you produce a unit of Y, there's cross-resistance. The bacteria becomes resistant to X from this production of Y by phi, by the amount phi, and same with X to Y. So then you might say, well, then okay, make patents long and make them broad. Don't let Y in the market if it's causing resistance on X. But that's only looking at the biological externality. There's also an economic externality, the conventional one of business dealing, right? When Y contributes cross-resistance, it's also grabbing some market share, and when it grabs market share, it's reducing output for X, and therefore own resistance is falling, such that total resistance could end up going down. And so if you look at, so what we just do is we look at very simply for an example of a quadratic utility in two products, two drugs, X and Y, and it's linear in cumulative, or the resistance rather, is linear in cumulative output. If you solve for the dynamic problem, which is very simple, and you allow for optimal patent policies and optimal antitrust policies and contracts, you get exactly what I had just said. That when a second drug will actually reduce resistance of the pioneer drug is when the biological externality, the cross-resistance to own resistance, is less than the economic externality of business dealing. When you're taking more output and reducing own resistance is greater than the cross resistance. That second drug can actually reduce the resistance of the pioneer drug. Okay? Got that? So that is saying patents shouldn't be broad, they should be narrow. We should allow competition into the market if we want our drugs to last longer. A little counterintuitive if they're causing these problems. But for that to be true, for this condition to hold, for there to be substitutes, oh, and I didn't explain what gamma is, sorry. Gamma is the substitutability between X and Y, okay? So if the substitutability of a second drug coming into the market satisfies this constraint, then that second drug will actually lower resistance. But a necessary condition for that is that the cross resistance phi is less than the own resistance created. What a second drug is contributing has to be less than what that drug is contributing. So is it? How about this heat map? This is from a scientific study on E. coli resistant drugs by Mamovic and Summer. And so what you have are a bunch of drugs along the y-axis and the same drugs along the x-axis. And what their experiment was they treated bacteria with the drugs on the y-axis. So they treated the bacteria, looked for resistant strains, and then they looked to see what impact it had on the drugs on the x-axis. So, you know, if you think of this one called Cipro, so they treated the bacteria with the Cipro, and then they looked to see the impact on Cipro. So in other words, the diagonal is the same as own resistance. The off diagonal are referring to cross resistance, okay? The darker the orange, the greater the resistance. And you see along the diagonal, that resistance created by the production of that same drug is greater than the resistance that's contributed from the other drugs. Now you may wonder what blue is. Blue is really cool. It's called collateral sensitivity. I'm not going to go into it, but it's when the drug actually reduces resistance if you use them together in a you know, compatible way. So anyway, what you see there is that the diagonal has darker orange and the off diagonal. That does mean that that condition is satisfied. So that this is less than 1, but it's a necessary condition because gamma, the substitutability is also going to be, you know, gamma over beta is also going to be less than 1. Okay, but that just says the second drug is reducing resistance of the first drug. Therefore, we want narrow patents. But is it welfare improving? Because if these two drugs that are in the market are such close substitutes, then the surplus generated may not be enough to pay for the R&D cost. So we solve that welfare problem. And there's actually an upper bound that you're going to need. You can't be too close of substitutes in economic space. All right? This gives you two policy implications. The first policy implication is that when looking at antibiotics, there should be actually two kinds of breadth. The first one is a biological breadth, or scope. You cannot get too close in biological space. That may be something the FDA worries about a little bit more. But the other one is the economic breadth. You can't get too close in product space. So instead of just having one patent breadth, you actually need to worry about the interplay between the economics and the biology. A second conclusion, policy conclusion, comes from this, and that is to say that, wait a minute, if you're going to let the second firm in so that the first firm has less resistance, the first firm now may not want to come into the market because it's now sharing the market with another firm. So the profits generated may not be sufficient. Well, that's true. So how do patent guys react to that? They say, well, then let's increase patent life, and let's increase patent breadth, and let's give this guy more, you know, stronger patents. And we're saying, no. Let patents actually solve the problem of optimal output. Let patents actually deal with the resistance problem, choose the breadth and the life in such a way that resistance is taken care of, and then to provide the right incentives for that firm to do the R&D, you have to use some other mechanism, whether it be prizes, market entry awards, patent buyouts, but something that's not related to output. You're not rewarded because of outputs. It's a fixed amount of money. How that would work, we haven't quite worked that out yet, but all we know is that this kind of turns the the patent calculus on its head. Typically, we think of patents as encouraging innovation, but at the cost of suboptimal output. And this is saying, let's use patents to encourage optimal output, optimal resistance, but at the cost of maybe not getting the innovation you want. And that's what I mean by saying, you know, patents, they're useful here, they're valuable, and you could come up with other mechanisms, maybe some taxes or something, that would achieve the same thing. But they're useful here, but not for the reason of getting innovation. You need something else. Okay, so that is, I want to summarize, but that is the end of my story. The saga continues on, but you know, I'm sure by now the bacteria in your gut are saying, where's the lobster? So let me just summarize, and then I'm going to go from kind of saying, so what the literature sort of showed, to what I think should happen. Okay, so here, remember the results run large, small, thicket, non-thicket, and there are two stages. The first one is, do they actually motivate pioneer research? And then do they allow, rather than saying do they block, follow-on research, I'm saying do they allow follow-on research? Because then you're looking for the yes, yeses. Do they motivate? Do they allow? If it's yes, yes, it means all right. If it's no, problem with the patent. Okay, so there are two places where they motivate and they allow. When small firms have the patent, yes, they give the incentive for that small firm to come into the market. And yes, they do not block. They do not block other firms when it's a small patentee. If it's a large patentee, there actually isn't, you know, there's data on this, or I mean, there's some studies on this, but I was trying to just think if there's causal data or causal results showing that as patents become stronger, large firms have the incentive to do R&D. Now, pharma will come along and say, you better believe it. You better give us patents. But I'm going to put a question mark there. But we do know that, no, they don't allow. When large firms have the patent, they block small firms. What do we know over here in the industries? And unfortunately, these studies didn't do interaction. It would really be nice if they had done the industry and the size of firm, but they didn't. Okay, so in the non-thicket industry, like drugs, yes, they motivate research, but we're saying, it may not always be the best mechanism for getting research and innovation. Do they allow follow-on? Yes, they don't block. That's what those previous studies showed. They don't block. So this is good too. This is good. Thicket industries, we don't know. Do they motivate? All those firms like semiconductors, do they really need a patent in order to do R&D? Do they really need a 20-year patent when they're probably the life of their product is 2 weeks? Do they allow follow-on research? No, they block. So how do we use this information to answer Boulder and Levine? I'm going to leave drugs alone for now because they do have some redeeming qualities. But what about thicket industries? Should patents be abolished in thicket industries? As Boulder and Levine said, they would go even further. Okay, what are these studies showing? These studies aren't really showing have patents, don't have patents. What they're really showing is what if we weaken them a little bit? What if we raise the standards of getting a patent? It's not saying let's take them away. What if we raise the standards? What if we narrow them? What if we, and so what it's really saying is if you can think about the IP innovation curve being U-shaped, this is very much like the Aguillon Aguillon et al. Innovation competition curve. There's also one that Park and others have estimated for different countries, and it's typically, inverted U. But if right now where we are is at B, then what we've really shown in these studies is moving to C will increase research, or increase innovation. But moving from B to A, if we think of this as the origin here, as being where we were in 1980, it doesn't really say to go there. But then again, if you think the curve really looks like that, it's more downward sloping than the U-shape, which they also estimated this in other countries, then hey, if you're going to go from B to C, why not go all the way and go back to 1980 levels? So this, understanding what that relationship is something that still needs to be done, and knowing where we are on that curve to actually have policy implications from all of this research. But you know what? I'm willing to go all the way and say software, business method patents, gene patents, let's get rid of those things. Let's go back to the 1980 when they didn't exist. It doesn't look like we're going to lose a lot. The myriad case is on, I didn't talk about gene patents, but the myriad breast cancer case, that actually has, again, pushed back. Gene patents are no longer patentable in the United States. They actually are in Canada. But the Supreme Court, you can see, is becoming tougher and tougher. Do I have time to just say what the implications are for Canada? Do you guys want to know what the implications are for Canada? Because I'm not really sure I know what they are. But let me just, okay, there are some studies, the Center of Study Living. Is Andrew here? Oh, okay. Oh, there you are. Okay, I know you end up with different conclusions from getting rid of patents. But there are three kind of neat things to know about the Canadian market. First of all, to Canadian inventors, patents sort of matter in Canada. They patent in Canada, but they patent 2 to 1 in the United States over Canada. Patenting outside of Canada is important. Only 12% of Canadian patents are held by Canadian inventors. The rest are by foreign companies. SMEs are a major player in Canadian innovations. They do about 45% of R&D in Canada. And this is kind of interesting. Canadian inventors have comparative advantage in high tech. There are a couple of places, aerospace, drugs, oil and gas, as you might expect, where they have a comparative advantage. But they really do in these high tech industries, the Thicket Industries. And they're not really the trolls. They don't seem to be the trolls because they're high quality. They receive 20% more patent citations than the world average. So what does this suggest? When you put the research together on the importance of patents to small firms and Thicket Industries and what the Supreme Court has been doing and what these basic things are about Canada. Am I making that noise? Implications for the policy given results from the literature is it seems that Canada would not really gain much by increasing patent protection. They constantly get pressured. The CETA agreement with Europe, they were kind of pressured to increase patents on drugs by 2 years. TPP, that was one of the biggest complaints, Bilski and others, is that this is just handing the patent system away to the foreign companies because it was about strengthening patents as well. So they're going to get pressured. And as I said, there's this chapter 11, I think it is, in NAFTA, which allows firms to, US firms to sue Canada. And like I said, when they negotiate, maybe Trump won't read that because he doesn't read too much. But if he does, he will probably want to keep that part. But then we know that it's important for small firms, so still keep the patent for the small firms. But just as we do in Canada, where there are differential tax credits and subsidies and things, keep those going to help the small firms and maybe even help them figure out how to navigate the thickets in the United States. And I guess the other point is just the US Supreme Court decisions to clear out Thicket Industry really bodes well for Canadian inventors because they have a comparative advantage in producing patents in those areas. And like I said, they're not the trolls. They're higher quality. So as the thickets clear out, they're going to probably gain quite a bit. We would expect to see more innovation going on. So that's all I will say for now. And thank you very much for your attention.